how to complete the seller compensation paragraph in the Georgia Association of REALTORS Seller Brokerage Agreement. Hi, everybody. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors and the director of the Real Estate Academy of America. And today's video is how to complete the seller compensation paragraph in the GAR contract forms without violating fair housing laws. What are you talking about, Dana? Sounds pretty important. Well, yes, it is pretty important. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and appreciate your tuning into this video. Please check out the entire playlist on the NAR Settlement, as well as the revised Georgia Association of Realtors contract forms that were revised in July of 2024. This video is being recorded August of 2024. And as we know, things are rapidly changing in our real estate world. So please make sure that whenever you are filling out a seller brokerage agreement, a buyer brokerage agreement, or any contract, that you are current with not only your broker and your broker's policies and procedures, but the most current rules and regulations governing your practice as a real estate agent. So all of that being said, GAR, Georgia Association of Realtors, in July did revise the compensation sections in the seller agreements as well as the buyer agreements to comply with the preliminary NAR settlement. Just as a side note, this is a preliminary settlement, and it could change, be tweaked, so forth and so on until this settlement agreement has been finalized by the courts. So things are changing very rapidly in general. So again, make sure you stay current. But in light of what we have on the table now, the regulations based on the settlement under which realtors must practice, that's the premise that GAR has revised the contracts in July, and that I'm going to walk you through the seller compensation section. So let me share my screen. Let me walk you through. I will link this below in the comments, in the description below. It has all my cheat sheet, all my notes, but it is a lot of notes. So I do want to walk you through it. So let me share my screen, and I will have to put on my glasses so that I don't squint so much. All right. This is the exclusive seller brokerage agreement in the Georgia Association of Realtors contract package. It is F101. It is the same verbiage in the non-exclusive seller brokerage agreement and very similar verbiage to what a seller customer, so those are what a seller client would fill out, what a seller customer would sign is the authorization to show unlisted property. The compensation section in that form is a little different, but conceptually it is the same. So generally speaking, your public people with whom you work, buyers and sellers, when you are disclosing, negotiating, they are agreeing to compensation. It must be disclosed, it must be in writing, and it must be agreed upon and approved by your buyers and sellers, by the party paying the compensation. And the buyer side is a little different. Please watch that video. But it must be specific and or calculable. What does that mean? That means it cannot be open-ended. For example, you cannot say this is illegal anyway, a net listing, but you can't say the seller can't agree to compensation. I will pay X amount of compensation, and whatever you can get over that is good for you. That is open-ended and not calculable and not allowed. That's never been allowed, actually. But the compensation section, again, in the revision that came out July 1st, the first paragraph is in direct compliance with the NAR settlement that says Our brokerage agreements must state that compensation is negotiable and not set by state law. So GAR in paragraph 4A has added a brand new paragraph. Actually, let me back up. The compensation section in Georgia for our sellers has been there for years and years and years. This is not new for our Georgia contracts. Now, the verbiage and the separation of the paragraphs and how this is spelled out, that is a little bit more explicit for clarity's sake, but a seller in Georgia in our brokerage agreements has always had to agree on the amount of compensation that they were paying for the real estate services and what for years and years and years. And then recently, but still for many years, it has been in there. They have had to approve of any co-op fees, any compensation they pay a listing broker. A seller has had to approve of how that broker, if that broker is sharing that compensation with a buyer's broker, they have had to agree to that. And that's been on our contract for several years. So back to today's contract as of July 1st. The paragraph is called Compensation of Brokers for Professional Services. Generally, compensation of brokers is negotiable and is not set by state law. However, this does not obligate individual licensees and brokerage firms to necessarily negotiate their compensation. The next paragraph is compensation to the seller's broker. This is how much the seller is paying their own broker who is representing them. This is a brokerage agreement, so representing them in a client relationship to list their house and get it sold. Seller agrees to pay seller's broker the following compensation at the closing of any contract to sell. And there are 3 check boxes there. The first one is where this compensation is expressed as a percent of the sale price. Now, don't get confused. The 2 fill in the blanks. One is where you spell it out in words, and the next one is where you spell it out as a number. So a percent of the sale price. The next one would be a flat fee dollar amount. And the third one is other. So I've received lots of questions. Dana, what is that other? What would that be? Well, for example, that could be if the seller is paying the broker a marketing fee or a fee for professional photos. And again, where the compensation to the broker may not be open-ended, you have to have a specific amount. So you cannot just open-endedly say marketing fee or seller to pay for professional photos. You have to put in, for example, always check with your own broker for what is acceptable by the broker who holds your license. But for example, for illustrative purposes, a marketing fee of X amount of dollars, or compensation to seller's broker, professional photos not to exceed X amount of dollars. So it has to be a specific amount or a way to calculate that amount. For example, not to exceed so much. Listing agents, make sure you check all the boxes that apply. So for example, if a seller is going to pay your broker a fee of a certain percent of the sale price and a marketing fee, you would have to check both of those boxes. And I have a little side note for you here. Seller must approve of the listing broker's sharing of a compensation in a co-op situation with a buyer's broker. See paragraph C below. So it has been in the listing agreements for a long time that if the seller is paying their own broker a certain percent of the sale price, and the seller agrees that their broker may share part of that compensation with a buyer's broker, what we have referred to as a co-op fee, co-op situation, co-op compensation, co-op commission. Again, that has been in our contracts for several years. And that is now spelled out in the subparagraph C, optional compensation for buyer's broker. A seller has never been required to compensate a buyer's broker or to agree to allow you as their broker to share your compensation with a buyer's broker. That has never been a requirement here in Georgia, but now in the July 1st revision of the contract, GAR just simply clarified that by putting in the word optional compensation to buyer's broker. And that paragraph reads, seller hereby approves the following compensation, if any, being paid to buyer's broker, either by the seller in addition to the compensation that they're paying their own broker, or by the seller's broker out of the compensation being paid to them, or seller and seller's broker as set forth in other section below. Listing agents, when you are with a seller and you are completing this seller brokerage agreement, do not leave those blank. Do not leave these check boxes blank. Make sure that the seller, you and the seller negotiate. If the seller agrees to compensate the buyer's broker, how is the seller going to do that? This first option, seller, you check this box if the seller is going to compensate a buyer's broker directly. And how will you know that? How will that be determined? That would be determined in an actual offer received from a buyer. The buyer would request in an offer that the seller compensate the buyer's broker directly. So that's what you would mark if the seller agrees to that. This next checkbox, seller's broker out of that money being paid, that's what we have done as a co-op. That's what we talk about as a co-op fee, a co-op arrangement, co-op compensation, co-op commission. And so that would mean you would check this box if the seller is paying your broker, the listing broker, a big pile of money, and they say, okay, out of the pile of money I'm paying you, you are allowed to share that, part of that, with a broker that is bringing a buyer who is, if that buyer, motivated, qualified, ready, willing, and able buyer to go buy my house, you can share part of that money with them, but these are the terms under which you can share that. So that second box, you check that for a co-op situation. This third box is if it is a combination of that. So the seller up front could say, okay, listing broker, my agent, I'm going to pay you X amount of dollars. You can share part of that with a buyer's broker. And in addition, I'm willing to also compensate a buyer's broker directly an additional certain amount of money based on percent of the sale price or flat fee. And that's just going to depend on the offer that I get. So if it's any combination of that, you're going to mark this checkbox. And again, that compensation to a buyer's broker coming from the seller's side, whether it be from the seller directly or from the seller's broker, is expressed either as a percent of the sale price, a flat fee, or that other arrangement. Again, check all the boxes that apply. Now, I have notes here for other. It's just because I ran out of room in the next section. But this next section is, it says, if the seller's offer of compensation to the buyer's broker is conditional, specify the conditions here. These are my notes for you as a listing agent to remember. GAR has included this next section because the NAR settlement specifically states that realtors are prohibited, they have eliminated the requirement for the seller to offer a blanket or unconditional or unilateral offer of compensation to the buyer's broker. Oh my goodness, that is a mouthful. What on earth does that mean? That means that the seller's offer of compensation to a buyer's broker does not have to be the same to every buyer's broker. This is where the caveat to you as a listing agent and to you sellers watching this, you need to be extremely careful to not violate fair housing laws, state fair housing laws, or federal fair housing laws. How do we do that? Well, the settlement says that you don't have to offer a blank or the same co-op fee or buyer broker compensation to every buyer's broker. Any variation that a seller or a listing broker is offering in compensation to a buyer's broker must be related to the terms of the offer and have nothing to do with the buyer or the buyer's agent or broker personally. That is where you could potentially violate or be accused of violating fair housing laws. So I have a note here. My first note is that the NAR, what the NAR settlement says, again, eliminate the requirement for blanket unconditional unilateral offers of compensation to buyer's broker. And this is my note to you. Avoid fair housing law violation. Variation in compensation should be related to the terms of the offer, not in response to the buyer or the buyer's broker. Additionally, that needs to be spelled out in advance. That is going to protect our sellers and protect our listing agents and brokers as well, that any variation in compensation should be determined in advance and not specifically with any one offer or any different offers that the seller gets. Okay, Dana, I'm still confused. What do you mean? You talk a lot. Yes, I do. So, for example, you need to specify the conditions here. You need to specify the conditions, you listing agents, when you are taking the listing, rather than changing the condition of buyer broker compensation with an offer. So, for example, I have some examples here. Again, please, you must check with your own broker regarding your broker's policies, procedures, current guidelines, regulations. Your brokers, we are all navigating this simultaneously. This is new for all of us throughout the entire country, as a matter of fact. So our brokers are having guidelines and ways of doing things right now without necessarily making policies or procedures. Just stay current with your broker and what's going on as we work through all of this together. But my example is, for example, one of the conditions could be, if no other agent is involved, buyer's broker to receive X percent. And that percent would be different than what the seller had agreed to up here in paragraph C. Or another condition could be something such as the seller will pay from the seller side, either from you as from the seller's broker or from the seller directly, will compensate the buyer's broker a certain percent of the sale price with the closing by this date, and a different percent of the sale price with the closing by a different date. And we see that concept all the time, especially with when we're getting close to deadlines like school starting, or sometimes a lot of new construction will do that before the end of the year because they really want to move their inventory, that they'll offer a bonus or an increase, or an increase in a percent of the commission, an increase in the commission to a buyer's agent, buyer's broker, with the closing by a certain date prior to the end of the year. So that's not a foreign concept. We see that all the time. So a seller is willing to do that as well with the dates. That could also be something such as seller to compensate a buyer's broker a bonus of X amount of dollars with whatever, an offer by such and such date, a closing by such and such date, a certain a final contract price of X versus Y. But my point to you is, any variation in compensation to a buyer's broker needs to be related to something having to do with the terms of the contract, regardless of who the buyer is or who the buyer's agent or broker is. That is how you're going to avoid fair housing, and having it written out and specified in advance in your buyer brokerage agreement, which GAR has allowed for us to do with these subparagraphs and the fill in the blanks. Additionally, It goes on to say that for all purposes herein, the term buyer's broker shall mean broker, including the broker representing the seller, if they are also working with or representing the buyer as a customer or client. Okay, now that's a bit confusing too. What is that all about? Well, this is GAR having this verbiage in here so that if there was only one agent involved, and the agent involved is representing the seller as a client and their broker is, and let's say you get a sign call and that buyer ends up wanting to buy that house. Well, if there is no other broker or agent involved, you are allowed, well, you need to check with your broker, but there is no license law violation in Georgia for one broker and one agent with one broker to have both sides of a deal. If it's one broker and two agents and each agent has a client relationship with their party, that's designated agency. If there is one broker and one agent and that agent has a client relationship with both parties, that is dual agency. Now, dual agency is legal with disclosure and written agreement. However, your broker may not allow it as a policy. An agent there can be a broker who has, and one broker, one agent have both sides of a deal, but working with one party as a client and one party as a customer. For example, one broker, you're the listing agent, you've signed a exclusive seller brokerage agreement with the seller. That creates the client relationship with the seller. You get a sign call, buyer wants to buy it. You explain agency relationships, client relationships, and customer relationships with the buyer. You offer the buyer the opportunity to have their own agent represent them as a client. And they say, no, I want to work with you as a customer. You explain to them that you can perform ministerial acts and you share with them what that means. They are completely clear on that and they choose to be a customer of your broker. So one broker, one agent, client relationship with, in my example, the seller, customer relationship with the buyer. That's having both sides and is legal per license law in Georgia. Again, check with your broker, even on having both sides. But if that's the situation, the compensation coming from the seller has still agreed to compensate the seller's broker, the broker representing the seller in a transaction, and the broker representing or working with a buyer in a transaction. So this down here, this is code. It's not really that code, but it is. Working with means that the agent or broker, the relationship with their party, with, in this example, the buyer, is that of a customer. Representing means the relationship between the broker and the buyer is that of a client. So working with or representing, and GAR just went ahead and spelled it out. That's why it's not really code. Working with or representing the buyer as a customer or client. This means that the seller is obligated to pay whatever commission, whatever compensation they agreed to in these paragraphs up here, even if there is no other broker involved. So again, that's what this last subparagraph means, to cover agents having both sides. I think it is in your best interest and the seller's best interest if there is going to be a difference in the compensation to your broker. If you do have both sides, you need to spell that out. And then this last subparagraph D, y'all do not leave this blank. This is separate compensation on a lease. Even if a seller hires you to sell their house and their intent is to sell their house, well, things change. They could decide to lease it, number one, or the offer you get from a buyer could be that of a lease purchase, which is a full-blown contract with a closing date, but the closing date is extended out into the future with an interim lease. That's a lease purchase. If that's the situation, then the seller would compensate the broker on the lease portion, either an outright lease or the lease purchase portion, the lease portion of a lease purchase. And so you don't want to leave this blank. And it says, if seller leases the property or enters into a lease purchase agreement or a lease with an option to purchase, seller shall also pay broker a separate leasing commission in the amount of $, fill in the blank, don't leave it blank, and as follows. This is the terms, and I just I get a lot of questions on this. So I put, for example, within 72 business hours after fully executed lease, or within a certain amount of time after tenant takes possession, or something along those lines. And then it goes on to say, notwithstanding any provision to the contrary, the payment of a leasing compensation, including a lease purchase, does not relieve the seller from paying the compensation at the closing of the actual purchase and sale, or contract to sale is provided elsewhere. So again, I wanted to walk through this. I will link this below with all my notes. I have a lot of notes, but I hope this video helped you. Thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate your time. Dana Sparks, broker of Maximum One Greater Atlanta Realtors, satisfying your needs with service, innovation, and education. Bye. If you like that video, check out the one here. If you like the content on this entire channel, please click here to subscribe. I try to take even the most complicated of real estate situations and make them crystal clear. See what I did there? Real estate made crystal clear. Thank you guys so much for watching.